What was an average weight of warbows in the medieval period, and what was the minimum weight requirement to be appropriate for military application? Both the minimum and average weight for warbows in the medieval period is a topic that is debated amongst historians and enthusiasts alike. The most common opinion for minimum draw weight is 70 pounds, with average weights being between 100 and 110 pounds and heavy weights being over 120 pounds. But some commentators believe 80 to 100 pounds was more indicative of the minimum weight of warbows, while 120 to 130 pounds were average weights. Short of going back in time, we can never know this answer with 100% certainty. However, we do have enough scholarly articles as well as surviving historical evidence to give a fairly accurate answer to this question. But before we weigh in on this debate, we first have to establish some parameters surrounding the question. What period of time are we talking about, and what geographic location? The medieval period in Europe lasted for close to 1,000 years, from roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD, while the medieval period in other parts of the world, like Japan and China, lasted till the 18th and 19th centuries. And we have to remember that while most people's first impressions of warbows is the famous weapon associated with Robin Hood, the English were not the only culture that held archery in high regards, placing a large emphasis of its use in their respective militaries. When giving weight to evidence in this debate, I think it's important that we don't overlook the opinions of lifelong historians that are the leading experts in their fields. Even though they may not know the precise to the pound answer, their lifelong dedication, access to historical and archaeological evidence, and the fact that their work is peer-reviewed cannot be discounted. In this presentation, we are going to rely on the opinions of two respected academics, Clifford Rogers and Thom Richardson. Clifford Rogers is a world-renowned historian and the professor of history at West Point. Some of his literature has been published in the 100 Years' War Part 2, specifically on pages 35 to 132, titled as the Battle of Agincourt. He makes two broad classifications for the strength of archers. On page 113, he says, quote, "However, using the above and taking 110 and 155 pound draw weights as average and strong for archers at Agincourt, we can reach the following conclusions." End quote. Clifford Rogers' opinion here, however, is limited to the Battle of Agincourt and not the greater medieval period. This is explicit in his literature. I think this is important, as I will give an opinion on this point of clarification later in the video. The second academic is Thom Richardson. Thom is the curator of the Royal Armouries, having previously worked at the British Museum and Manchester City Art Gallery, who has conducted his PhD on the subject of the medieval inventories of the Tower Armouries 1320 to 1410 at the University of York in 2012. According to a blog written by Thom on behalf of the Royal Armouries, he believes that, quote, "We now think they ranged in draw weight between 65 and 160 pounds with an average about 110. Double what we thought a generation ago." End quote. The context of this quote in regards to warbow weights I suspect is in relation to the change in opinions due to the Mary Rose discovery. In my opinion, it is more than likely the key evidence for their scholarly opinions is drawn from the Mary Rose, where 167 whole bows were recovered, as well as from the accounts of the Privy Wardrobe. This was the 14th century organisation which ran the armoury at the Tower of London and gave details about the manufacture, storage and issue of arms and armour, particularly of longbows and arrows, for the first half of the 100 Years' War. So what we have here is two academics that largely agree with each other. Granted that Clifford Rogers' opinion is specific to the Battle of Agincourt, nonetheless they both agree that the average draw weight of warbows, particularly in England during the later medieval period, was probably about 110 pounds. An opinion that I also share. I know right now both Clifford and Thom are breathing a collective sigh of relief that a random YouTuber is agreeing with their opinions and quantifying what no doubt they took decades of study and research and a lifelong dedication to history to draw the conclusions they have published. But in all seriousness, I think it's important that we do question others' opinions, even if those opinions are from academics. The reason I say this is because we just have to look at Thom Richardson's comments. In his blog on behalf of the Royal Armouries, he specifically states double what we thought a generation ago. This is a clear example of evolving opinion in the light of new evidence that may not have been available to previous scholars, despite those scholars having all the intelligence and credibility of later scholars. The simple truth is that as more evidence comes to light, then this gives us an opportunity to refine our opinions, or it might simply reaffirm previous opinions. What about other sources of evidence for the English medieval period? Outside of the Mary Rose discovery, we only have 4 existing bows. The first, the Spencer bow, the second, the Medlisham bow, the third, the Flodden bow, and the fourth, which is of particular interest to me, the Hedgeley Moor bow. 3 of these bows fall within the spectrum of what we accept as the weight of warbows, but according to 2 different sources that I'm aware of, the Hedgeley Moor bow is stated as being either 50 pounds or 60 pound draw weight. This raises some questions in regards to its legitimacy as a warbow rather than a hunting bow of the period. However, according to Gordon and Webb, the bow was used at the Battle of Hedgeley Moor in 1464, indicating that it was indeed a warbow. So, in summary, in regards to English warbows of the period, there is evidence that the minimum draw weight of warbows may have been under the commonly accepted figure of 70 pounds. In addition, the same sources generally put the average weight of warbows about 100 to 110 pounds draw weight. This brings us to sources from other cultures. While we don't have any other European sources that I'm aware of, we do have many Eastern sources, particularly from China, the Ottoman Empire, and Korea. We will begin with China, and we will see if the information that exists on their bows marries up with the information that we have on English bows. China had a culture of archery and fielded a professional army that took archery very seriously. Archery was considered the premier weapon in China across multiple dynasties. In the Jing dynasty, early 18th century, we have surviving military exams for soldiers that are tested based on the draw weights that they were proficient with. One such military report from the 500 men at the Dessau garrison reported that the men all were able to fire at least 67-pound bows. The report is very specific in that the minimum weight for the soldiers was 5-strength bows. The Chinese did not use pounds, but the conversion for this Chinese draw weight is 67 pounds. The breakdown of the capabilities of the garrison was as follows. 75 men could draw 67 pounds, representing 15% of the garrison. 297 men could draw between 67 and 80 pounds, which was 60% of the garrison. 203 men could draw 80 plus pounds, which was 40% of the garrison. 137 men could draw 93 plus pounds, which was 27.4% of the garrison, and 85 men could draw 133 pounds, which was 17% of the garrison. Another report from the same period of the 3,200-man garrison of Hangzhou had the following breakdown of its soldiers' capabilities. 2,200 men could draw between 80 and 133-pound bows, representing 68% of the garrison, while only 80 men could handle between 147 and 173-pound bows, representing just 2.5% of the garrison. For the next source of information, I must give credit to Justin Ma from The Way of Archery. If you have not visited his YouTube channel, I suggest you do, as it is a treasure trove of knowledge in regards to Chinese military archery. During the Ming Dynasty of the 14th to the 17th century, we have 2 archery manuals surviving, the Gao Ying Archery Manual as well as the Li Shengfen Archery Manual. According to Gao Ying, the minimum draw weight was 65 pounds and ranged up to 130 pounds, with 39 pounds being an appropriate weight for rookies. According to Li Shengfen, an exceptional weight was 120 pounds, and for all other bows it ranged from 36 to 96 pounds in draw weight. From these Chinese sources, we can clearly see that the minimum draw weight for Chinese soldiers started at 65 pounds. This draw weight is identical to the opinion held by Richardson in regards to English warbows. In regards to average weights, the majority of Chinese archers were using bows somewhere between 80 and 133 pounds. If we take the median point of this data sample as being close to the average weight of Chinese warbows, then the draw weight would be 106.5 pounds, which is not far off the average weights of English warbows according to Richardson and Rogers. Furthermore, the statement referred to as strong by Rogers for archers of Agincourt is reflected in the historic reports of the military exams. At the Dessau garrison, only 17% of the men could handle bows of 133 pounds, and at the Hangzhou garrison, only 2.5% of the men could handle bows over 147 pounds. The minimum, average, and elite draw weights of the Chinese military being close to those of the English should not come as a surprise. The Chinese were not some inferior genetic ethnicity that could not draw heavyweight bows compared to the Europeans. they were just as capable in the art of archery as any other nation. This comparison also highlights the importance of looking at multiple cultural sources to affirm the opinions held by European sources. It is evident that the similarities in standards of weights is no coincidence, despite the two cultures being separated by many thousands of kilometers. And in the spirit of Demtel commercials of the 90s, but wait, there is more. How do Ottoman sources marry up with the English and Chinese sources? According to Adam Karpowitz and his publication Ottoman Turkish Bows, Manufacture and Design, he believes that the average weight of Ottoman bows was 112 pounds. He also believes that the draw weights of most war bows that he refers to as battle bows was between 90 and 130 pounds at a 28-inch draw. This range in draw weight, according to Karpowitz, represents all data within one standard deviation from the average. So once again, we have another average draw weight figure that is close to both the English and Chinese sources. His opinion also implies strong draw weights would be in excess of 130 pounds, as bows of those weights would be greater than one standard deviation from the mean, representing the top 16% of Ottoman bows. However, there is one standard that Karpowitz does not adhere to that are held by both the Chinese and English sources. Karpowitz believes that 70 pounds would have been the minimum weight for Ottoman bows. Taking a quote from his publication, he states, "I do not believe bows below 70 pounds would have been made for grown men at the time, but probably for women, boys, and elderly, or exclusively for target shooting." Our last evidence comes from Korean sources, but before I divulge in the details, I must give credit to Jack Fang and his YouTube channel, Historical Archery, for the following information. Unlike Chinese sources, the Korean military exam metrics revolved around the weights of arrows and the distance that said arrows could achieve when loosed from bows. This is how they differentiated between the capabilities of the average archer or elite archer rather than based off the draw weight of bows. While the specifics of draw weights are not given in regards to minimum, average, or elite bows, we do have all the data to reverse engineer the draw weights based on the specs that are needed to be achieved in these military exams. Thanks to Jack Fang from Historical Archery, who has conducted these experiments, we now have some rough estimates for the draw weights applicable to Korean warbows. According to the military exams, a Korean strength bow in 1637 could loose a 1,350 grain arrow to beyond 96 meters, and an average archer would need to loose a 495 grain arrow to 144 meters. Using a modern replica bow, Jack Fang was able to ascertain what he believes would be the applicable draw weights to achieve these standards in the military exam. Jack estimates that average archers could have been using between 60 and 80 pound bows, while elite archers would have been using between 120 and 140 pound bows. Apart from the estimates of average archers, these conclusions are not inconsistent with Chinese, English, and Ottoman sources. However, it should be noted the context for average weights according to these exams is for mass recruitment, so it implies the men undergoing these exams are not trained soldiers but Koreans joining the military. This is important because it would seem the average weights for Chinese, Ottoman, and English archers are representative of men that have been trained in archery for some time. This may explain the difference in average weights from the Korean sources. Apart from this one inconsistency, we have yet more evidence that points towards minimum weight of bows being under 70 pounds and heavy draw weight bows being over 120 pounds. Although I think it would be disingenuous not to admit that the minimum draw weights relied on in these exams may not be indicative of the minimum draw weight of Korean soldiers' bows, as it is only intended as a standard for recruitment and not necessarily as a weapon of war. So let's do a quick recap now and put all the sources together and compare them to see where the consistencies are, where the inconsistencies are, and perhaps give some opinions on where there may be some differences, as well as where there are similarities and why those similarities existed. So for the English, Chinese, and Korean sources, in regards to minimum weights, those three sources do put war bows under 70 pounds. However, as I said earlier with the Korean sources, I think it's not fair to include the Korean source for minimum weights because the purpose of those bows may have been different to the purpose of the Chinese sources and the English sources, which were directly taken from soldiers or archers that were proficient in the art, had been training for it for some time, whereas the Korean sources, it seems to be men that they're trying to recruit for the army rather than a military exam of an established garrison with proficient archers. So I think that's the first one. But even so, we do have two sources, the Chinese and the English sources, which do give us, slightly under 70 pounds as that minimum weight. Now, I do have an opinion on that, which I will delve into later, but the other inconsistency that I wanted to talk about was the English source of the Strongbow at 155 pounds. Now, very well may have been that. I mean, we do have Chinese sources that do say 133 pounds plus. We have the Ottoman source, which is over 130 pounds, and we even have the Korean source, which is over 120 pounds. However, like if we look at the Ottoman source, it's the 130 pound plus represents 32% of the bows, or the top 32% of the bows. We don't really have a percentage reference for the Chinese sources or the Korean sources. They also might be top 32% bows, they might be top 20% bows, they might be top 15% bows. We don't know. And again, for the English source, we don't know what the percentage of the source is. However, we do know from the Chinese source, only 2.5% of the soldiers at the Hangzhou garrison were able to draw 147 plus bows. So with the English source, let's say it's comparable as a Clifford Rogers is referring to a 2.5 percentile as a strong or an elite type of standard. What we got to understand with the Battle of Agincourt, though, which is what I wanted to touch on, and I said that earlier in the video, was that this is an offensive campaign. Okay, England mandated all men, all free men, to train in the art of archery. So it was a cultural practice across the nation. When they went on campaign, they took, 6,000-7,000 men. We're not 100% sure on the exact figures, but they took probably somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 archers with them on that campaign. However, you've got a nation of potentially tens of thousands of archers that you can choose from. That may mean that you can pick and choose who you take with you. And when you have the luxury of picking and choosing who you want to take with you, you're naturally going to select, archers that are going to be above average, because you do have that luxury. Whereas on a defensive campaign, where you're being invaded, you're just going to mobilize whoever is available, the nearest soldiers, the nearest militias, the nearest archers. And that'll be more representative of a true average. And whatever the bell-shaped curve distribution of archers will be, it'll be organic and natural. Whereas on the offensive campaign, it will be slightly skewed to the right. They'll be slightly more than average, slightly more people will be able to draw these elite bows, because you're manipulating the recruitment process to take better archers. So I think that's important to remember. So despite these small inconsistencies, or lack of clarity on what really is an elite bow or a strong bow, I mean, it's pretty evident from the average weights and the minimum weights that they are very, very close together, particularly the English, Chinese, and Ottoman sources. We have 110 pounds for the English sources, we have about 106.5 pounds for the Chinese sources, and 112 pounds for the Ottoman sources. We're really talking about a 5% deviation, and that's a quite small margin of error. So I don't think it's a coincidence that all these sources are quoting similar draw weights. So I think we have to add an element of legitimacy to these sources, especially seeing as they are being corroborated from other cultures that also share similar practices in the emphasis that they put on archery for their militaries. So in my opinion, I don't think that the average weight being, roughly, let's say, around that 110 pound mark should be all that controversial. I believe that is quite accurate, and it's obviously being reflected in different sources, in different archaeological finds. You've got to remember, not only do we have the Mary Rose bows for the English, or those 5 other bows that have been found outside of the Mary Rose bows, we have surviving Ottoman bows, we have surviving Chinese bows, and we can objectively measure these bows and get a real mean of the archaeological evidence, as well as take the means from the manuscripts, and they marry up. And that's what's important. So I don't think that the average weight should be that controversial. However, the minimum weights, I think there is still a little bit of flex. I think we still need to delve into the information and get a bit more context as to the minimum weight. I'm perfectly happy to accept that the minimum weight may very well have been 65 pounds, but I think that we should add a little bit of context to the 65 pounds and perhaps the 70 pounds to get a better understanding of, what a minimum weight could have been. Because I think with the minimum weights, it would have been a little bit more fluid. I don't think that the minimum weight is just one figure, and I'll try and articulate that and explain what I mean when I say that. The purpose of a military-grade warbow was to be able to propel arrows at a certain velocity with sufficient power and range to be deemed appropriate for use in times of war. But the problem with the crafting process of warbows during the period is, unlike today, they aren't fabricated, they're all handcrafted, and there's a variance in performance, even in a bow that has the same draw weight. The bow may have been crafted from a different type of yew, so we have English yew, we have Italian yews, and not only just the two different yews or multiple different types of yews, we also have even two English yew bows may perform slightly different from each other because the staves that were sourced for the bows may have come from different trees. The boya themselves may have had slightly different crafting techniques. The grains within the wood may have been slightly different from bow to bow. And this is actually reflected in Clifford Rogers's literature, where he talks about 70-pound bows specifically. And he states that a 70-pound bow firing a weight-appropriate arrow could range in joules produced by those arrows from 45 to 58 joules of energy. And that's a 20% variance in energy. See, now today we have the benefit of being able to, put bows and the arrows through chronographs and get, consistent results. We can start mapping the power and the speed specifically and to accurately kind of classify a bow's power and appropriateness for war based on those objective figures. In the medieval times, they only really had one way of measuring the bow's performance, well, before it was fired, of course, and that was by its draw weight. So I think there's an element here of the craftsman at the time understanding that if they wanted a bow to consistently perform at a level that they knew would be appropriate to use for war, they knew that they had to build these bows at minimum at, say, at about 70 pounds. They knew that at 70 pounds they were able to produce consistent results. Now, that's not to say that they couldn't produce a bow of 60 or 65 pounds that would not perform like a 70 or 75 pound bow. Of course they could. But it's a bit of a hit and miss kind of affair. You don't want to be producing 65-pound bows and then only half of them being, good enough and performing well enough to say, okay, this bow can fire this far, or it can penetrate this many layers of gambeson at 15 feet, and now it's appropriate for war. That seems like a bit of a waste of manpower and effort. So I think when we talk about minimum weights, I think this context is important. Yes, a 65-pound bow can certainly be a war bow. But when they were crafting warbows at the time, I think it's logical that they would have said, okay, yes, we can make 65-pound bows, but if we want to be sure that we're outfitting and equipping our soldiers with bows that are appropriate and are going to perform within a spectrum that we're comfortable with, then we should be crafting them at 70 pounds. Now that is, of course, for English bows. For the recurve bows, specifically the Chinese bows, we do have multiple sources that these bows were 65 or 67 pounds at minimum. And I think the reason for this is because they are recurve bows. It's accepted that a recurve bow, or a composite recurve bow, should I say, is more efficient than a self bow. Okay, it delivers, for pound, it's able to more efficiently, propel the arrow faster and further, even though it may share the same draw weight as a longbow or a self bow. And I think this is important because if 70 pounds was the standard that the bowyers knew that, okay, if we build bows at 70 pounds, then we are going to get consistent results, and the bows that we are going to produce 99% of the times, they are going to be appropriate for, as use as a war bow, then I think you can draw that back for composite recurves, because the composite recurve bows, a 70-pound composite recurve bow on average is going to be a little bit better performing than a 70-pound self bow. Therefore, you can consistently apply the same kind of standard with recurve bows, whereas the boys would have said, okay, we need to produce 65 or 67-pound bows to get the same type of consistent results that the English bowyers would have had to do for self bows. So I think that this point of clarification is important. It does mean that on a global sense, that yes, the minimum draw weight for a war bow may very well be 65 pounds, but it's a nuanced or a contextual answer. When we talk about the global kind of war bow category, we are talking about Chinese war bows as well. However, if we're going to go from region to region, then we have to kind of separate the self bows from the West and Northern Europe, from the Eastern European and Middle Eastern and Far Eastern sources of bows, which are the recurves. So I think this kind of point of clarity is very, very important. It's something that we don't see in this conversation when we talk about warbows. It's like everyone just lumps all types of bows into one broad category, and they don't kind of nuance or give context to the difference in efficiency between the different types of styles of bows. And I think that this demonstration or this presentation of the evidence does show this. We do see, that 70 pounds probably was more appropriate for English bows, and 65 pounds may have been the equivalent of that 70-pound bow for self bows. But even though that 70 pounds bows would have been probably the most appropriate draw weight for English style self bows, I don't think that does preclude, the rare, or perhaps not rare, the uncommon or unusual 65-pound bow from being a war bow. Just imagine a scenario, Pete comes along to be recruited for the next campaign. Sergeant Thomas says, tell me, Pete, how many draw weights, how many pounds draw weight is your bow? It's 65 pounds. Sorry, Pete, it's a little bit too light. But no, my bow performs just as well as a 70 or 75 pound bows. Okay, prove it. He pulls an arrow out, fires the bow, and then they can objectively, measure the distance that arrow has been fired. And if they see, wow, it's, firing at the distance is what we expect a 70 or 75 pound bow, that's one objective way of saying, okay, Pete, well, maybe your bow is appropriate for war. Another thing they can do is just put it side by side with a 70 or 75 pound bow, count down, 3, 2, 1, they both loose at the same time, and then you have observers on the flanks, and they can see these arrows fly. They will be able to see if one arrow is flying faster than the other. If they're flying, head to head, and they're traveling the same distance, and they're landing at the same time, which means they're traveling at the same speeds, then you can say, okay, Pete, your bow is good enough, to participate in said campaign. Perhaps this didn't happen, perhaps it did happen, I don't know. But the point is that, no bow is going to perform identically like another bow. It's possible that 65-pound bows could have been war bows. It just would have been an unusual weight for a war bow. So I think this little bit of context is also important to this discussion. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed this video. I hope it wasn't too long. I hope you learned something. If you disagree with something, if you have more to add, if there are other sources that I didn't mention, please put them in the comments. I love these types of debates. I love these discussions. And with that, I thank you very much, and thank you for listening.